collapsed mid-performance. On April 17, 1987, comedian and actor Dick Shawn was performing a one-man show at Mandeville Auditorium on the campus of the University of California, San Diego. He was 63 years old. He had been working in American comedy and film for decades. Shawn had built a reputation as one of the most unpredictable performers in the business. His style resisted easy categorization. He was absurdist when absurdism was not yet a comfortable label. He was physical, strange, and deliberately difficult to read. Audiences who came to see Dick Shawn came prepared for anything. That was the contract he had established over a career spanning television appearances, film roles, and live performance. He was perhaps best known to mainstream audiences for his role in The Producers, the 1967 Mel Brooks film, where he played a hippie actor cast as Adolf Hitler in a deliberately terrible Broadway show. The role suited him. He was the kind of performer who made discomfort funny. The University of California, San Diego was a fitting venue for that kind of comedy. The audience that night was primed for the unexpected. They had come to see Dick Shawn, which meant they had come to see something they could not anticipate. The show had been proceeding. Shawn was mid-performance, working through his set in the way he always had, with unpredictability built into every movement and every pause. The audience was engaged. They were watching a man who had made a career out of defying their expectations, and so far that evening, he had delivered exactly what they had paid for. He had been on stage roughly 20 minutes, in the middle of a routine in which he was portraying a politician imagining the world after a nuclear catastrophe. The character had just declared that if everyone outside the room were dead, he would be their leader. Then he collapsed. He fell face forward onto the stage. It happened during the performance, in the middle of his act, in front of the roughly 500 people in that auditorium. The audience laughed. This is the detail that makes the story what it is. They laughed because Dick Shawn falling face forward onto a stage was, in the context of a Dick Shawn performance, entirely plausible as a bit. It looked like comedy. It was staged at a moment when anything could be stageable. The applause followed the laughter. The crowd responded to what they believed was a deliberate physical gag from a performer known for deliberate physical gags. He did not get up. The laughter continued for a period of time. Several minutes passed. The audience held with the bit, waiting for the punchline, waiting for him to spring back up, waiting for whatever was coming next. Nothing came next. At some point, the recognition shifted. Someone in the auditorium understood that what they were looking at was not comedy. The performance had stopped being a performance. The man on the stage was not performing. A stagehand came out, examined him, and called into the audience asking for a doctor. Emergency assistance was called. Responders arrived at the venue. By the time the situation had been recognized as a medical emergency, significant time had elapsed from the moment Shawn hit the stage. The delay was not born of indifference. It was born of the context he himself had spent a career constructing. An audience that expected the unexpected had no reliable framework for recognizing when the unexpected had become real. Resuscitation was attempted. Shawn was transported to Scripps Memorial Hospital. The efforts made to revive him could not succeed. Dick Shawn was pronounced dead at Scripps Memorial Hospital on April 17, 1987. He was 63 years old. Cause of death, heart attack. Ring rope drop. On May 23, 1999, professional wrestler and performer Owen Hart was scheduled to descend from the rafters of Kemper Arena in Kansas City, Missouri, as part of his entrance for the World Wrestling Federation's Over the Edge pay-per-view event. He was 34 years old. The arena was full, with a broader audience watching live on pay-per-view at home. Owen Hart had been a professional wrestler for over a decade. He came from one of the most recognized families in the history of the sport, the Hart family of Calgary, Alberta. His father, Stu Hart, had trained wrestlers for generations out of the Hart family home. Owen had grown up in that world. He had trained rigorously and had developed into one of the most technically skilled performers in the WWF roster. He was known for his in-ring ability, for his precise and controlled style, and for a comedic character persona that had made him genuinely popular with audiences. By 1999, he had held multiple titles and had been a fixture of WWF programming for years. The character he was performing as that night was the Blue Blazer, a costumed superhero persona that Hart had used at various points in his career. The entrance planned for that evening involved Hart being lowered from the rafters of Kemper Arena on a cable and harness system, descending dramatically toward the ring as part of the theatrical presentation of the character. The character was being played as a bumbling, parodic superhero, and the descent was intended to end with Hart releasing himself from the harness a few feet above the ring and tumbling clumsily forward for comic effect. The mechanism that was supposed to make this possible was a quick-release clip on the harness. A harness and cable rigging system had been set up in the arena's rafters for the descent. Hart was fitted into the harness backstage before the sequence began. The arena was loud, lit, and full. 16,000 people were watching the ring and the space above it. The quick release mechanism on the harness disengaged prematurely. Hart fell approximately 78 feet. He struck the top rope of the wrestling ring chest first during the fall, approximately a foot from the nearest turnbuckle. The impact was witnessed by the live audience in Kemper Arena. Pay-per-view viewers at home, however, did not see the fall itself. A pre-taped vignette featuring Hart's character was airing on the broadcast at the moment he came down. There was no ambiguity inside the arena about what had happened. The fall was visible to the entire crowd. Medical personnel were stationed on site, as they were at every WWF live event. They reached Hart in the ring immediately after he came down. Assessment began at once. The injuries sustained in a fall of 78 feet onto the top rope of a wrestling ring were severe and immediate. Hart was removed from the ring and transported from the arena. Emergency medical care continued during transport. He was taken to Truman Medical Center in Kansas City. The Over the Edge event continued after Hart was taken from the arena. This decision, made by WWF Chairman Vince McMahon during the broadcast, became a subject of significant public and legal scrutiny in the months and years that followed. At Truman Medical Center, efforts to treat Hart's injuries were unsuccessful. He died that evening. Owen Hart was pronounced dead at Truman Medical Center. He was 34 years old. Cause of death: blunt force chest trauma resulting in a severed aorta, internal hemorrhaging, and cardiac arrest. Subsequent litigation brought by the Hart family alleged that the harness and rigging system, sourced from a different supplier than the system used for similar descents and other promotions, was defective and inadequate for the load it was asked to bear. The case was settled in November of 2000 for $18 million. Dagger scene fatal. On March 31, 1993, actor Brandon Lee was on set at Carolco Studios in Wilmington, North Carolina, filming a scene for the feature film The Crow. He was 28 years old. The production was 8 days from completion of principal photography. Lee was the son of martial arts legend and actor Bruce Lee, and he had been building a film career of his own through the late 1980s and early 1990s. The Crow was the most significant project he had taken on. He was playing the lead role, a murdered musician who returns from the dead to seek justice. Production had been underway in Wilmington since February, and Lee had been working consistently through the shoot. The scene being filmed in the early hours of March 31st was one in which his character was shot and killed. A Smith & Wesson Model 6 S2944 Magnum revolver was in use on set as a prop firearm for the production. Prop firearms are a standard element of film production, and the Crow production had been using this weapon in various configurations throughout filming. Prior to the scene that night, the .44 Magnum had been used during close-up photography with dummy rounds, which are inert cartridges loaded into a weapon so that the cylinder appears full on camera. The dummy rounds used on this production had been improvised on set, live cartridges with the powder removed, but, critically, with the primers left intact. When one of those dummy rounds was discharged during a previous filming session, its primer ignited by the firing pin even without powder behind it. The bullet was generated enough force to separate from the casing and lodge inside the barrel of the weapon. This was not detected when the gun was collected and prepared for subsequent use with blank cartridges for the shooting scene. When the scene was filmed and the blank cartridge was discharged, the lodged bullet was still inside the barrel. The gas pressure released by the blank's powder load propelled it forward with lethal velocity, comparable to that of a live round. It struck Lee in the abdomen at a distance of approximately 12 to 15 feet, fired by his co-star Michael Massey. He was standing on the set, in the middle of a filmed scene, with cast and crew present around him. He fell backward instead of forward, as the choreography of the scene had called for. When the director called, Cut and Lee did not get up. The crew initially believed he was either still acting or that he had been disoriented by an impact with the set. There was no visible bleeding. By the time the crew realized he had been shot, valuable seconds had been lost. Emergency services were called. Lee was transported from the studio to New Hanover Regional Medical Center in Wilmington. At New Hanover Regional Medical Center, surgeons operated on Lee for approximately 6 hours. The injury was severe. The bullet had passed through several vital organs and lodged in his spine. The surgical team worked through the morning. They could not stop what the wound had set in motion. Brandon Lee was pronounced dead at New Hanover Regional Medical Center at approximately 1 in the afternoon on March 31st, 1993, roughly 13 hours after the discharge that wounded him. He was 28 years old. Cause of death: massive internal hemorrhaging from the abdominal gunshot wound sustained on set. A subsequent investigation by the New Hanover County District Attorney concluded that the death was accidental, the result of negligence in the handling and inspection of the prop weapon. No criminal charges were filed. Curtain call collapse. On November 30th, 1958, actor Gareth Jones was performing in a live television drama broadcast on the ITV network in the United Kingdom. The production was in the episode of the anthology series Armchair Theatre, made by ABC Television, titled Underground. Jones was 33 years old. He was working in British television at a time when television drama was broadcast live, without delay, without the ability to stop and start over. Live television drama in 1958 operated under conditions that have no modern equivalent in scripted programming. There was no tape. There was no recorded safety net. Whatever happened in the studio went out over the airwaves in real time. Directors managed the broadcast from a control room, making decisions in the moment. Actors moved between sets within the studio, hitting marks, delivering lines, and transitioning between scenes on a schedule that allowed for no deviation. The technical crew, the camera operators, the sound engineers, all of them were working in continuous motion from the moment the broadcast began until the moment it ended. ABC Television, transmitting under contract to ITV, was one of the major commercial broadcasters operating in Britain at the time. Underground, a play adapted by James Forsyth from Harold Reen's novel about a group of survivors trapped in the London Underground after a nuclear strike, was being broadcast that evening from ABC's studios in Didsbury, Manchester. The production was directed by Ted Kotcheff and produced by Sidney Newman. Jones was a working actor playing the role of Carl Norman, a businessman. There was a particular irony embedded in the role he was playing that night. Jones's character, in the script, was supposed to die of a heart attack during the course of the play. Between scenes, in the second act, Jones collapsed. The most cited account places him in the makeup area where a makeup artist was rapidly applying simulated dirt to his face for his next scene. He told her he felt sick. Then he fell forward onto her tray. Other accounts placed the collapse in the wings, with cast member Peter Bowles recalling later that he saw Jones approaching the set on camera and then watched him go down. Either way, the broadcast was live, and it did not stop. The director, Ted Kotcheff, managing the production from the control room, had to respond in real time. Producer Sidney Newman, watching from a nearby office, ran into the control room and famously instructed Kotcheff to shoot it like a football match, to follow the actors and let the play improvise around the missing character. The remaining cast members had to respond in real time as well. There was no mechanism for pausing the broadcast, no way to cut to a previously recorded segment, no option to tell the viewing audience at home that something had happened and the show would resume later. The cast improvised. Jones's lines were redistributed, adjustments were made during a brief commercial break, and the play was carried to its conclusion. The audience at home, an estimated 8 to 12 million viewers, did not know that anything had gone wrong. The other actors were not told that Jones had died until after the broadcast ended. Efforts were made to assist Jones backstage by a doctor who had been stationed at the studio in case of accidents involving the rubble strewn across the set. He could not be revived. Gareth Jones died during the live broadcast of Underground on November 30th, 1958. He was 33 years old. Cause of death, heart attack. The same cause his character was scripted to die from, in the same broadcast he never finished. Audience watched helpless. On April 15, 1984, comedian and actor Tommy Cooper was performing live at Her Majesty's Theatre in London as part of a televised variety program called Live from Her Majesty's, broadcast on the ITV network and produced by London Weekend Television. He was 63 years old. The theatre was full, and an estimated 12 million additional viewers were watching the broadcast at home. Tommy Cooper had been a fixture of British entertainment for decades. He was a large man, physically distinctive, instantly recognizable from the fez he wore on stage. His act was built around magic tricks, and the magic tricks were built around failure. He performed illusions that went wrong in elaborate, impossible ways. He stumbled and bumbled and reacted with exaggerated confusion to his own failures. The audience laughed because the failure was the point. He had refined this approach over a long career in clubs, theaters, and television, and he had become one of the most beloved comedic performers in Britain. By 1984, Cooper had been performing for well over 30 years. He was a familiar presence on British television. He had done specials, series, and countless live appearances. Her Majesty's Theatre was a prestigious West End venue, and a live television broadcast from its stage was a significant event. The audience in the theatre that evening had come to see one of the country's most celebrated entertainers. The cameras were there for the same reason. The variety show was underway. Cooper was performing his act, the familiar combination of attempted illusions and deliberate comedic incompetence that his audiences had come to love. An assistant had helped him put on a cloak for a bit in which the host, Jimmy Tarbuck, hidden behind the curtain, was to pass him props that he would seem to pull from inside the gown. Cooper said, "Thank you, love," to the assistant. The theater was responding. The crowd was with him. Then he slumped. He did not fall immediately. He slumped first, visibly losing control of his posture, leaning back against the curtain, and then he went down. The audience laughed. This was Tommy Cooper. Tommy Cooper slumped and stumbled and fell as a matter of professional practice. The crowd had seen him do versions of this hundreds of times. The laughter made sense given everything they knew about him. For a period of time, the audience maintained this interpretation. He was on the floor. The laughter continued. The situation did not resolve itself into the next bit. He did not get up. Stage crew moved to assist. The curtain was closed in front of Cooper while production cut to an early commercial break. Behind the curtain, paramedics were attempting resuscitation. In front of the curtain, the show resumed. The comedy duo Les Dennis and Dustin G were sent out to perform their routine while the work to revive Cooper continued a few feet behind them. They could hear the chest compressions as they tried to get laughs. Cooper was taken backstage and then by ambulance to Westminster Hospital. Tommy Cooper was pronounced dead at Westminster Hospital on April 15, 1984. He was 63 years old. Cause of death, heart attack. Blade missed mark. On April 26, 1976, actor Sid James collapsed on stage during the opening night of a touring stage production of the farce The Mating Season at the Sunderland Empire Theatre in Sunderland, England. He was 62 years old. Approximately 350 people were in the audience that evening. Sid James had spent decades building one of the most recognizable careers in British entertainment. He was South African-born, had come to Britain after the Second World War, and had worked consistently through film and television from the 1950s onward. He was known to an enormous segment of the British public through the Carry On film series, a long-running franchise of broad comedy films in which James appeared in 19 separate entries through the 1960s and 70s. His face, his voice, and his particular style of delivery had become familiar to multiple generations of British audiences. He was also the star of the long-running television sitcom Bless This House. By 1976, he was 62 years old and still working steadily in live theater, despite having survived a serious heart attack 9 years earlier. The Mating Season, written by Irish playwright Sam Cree, was a touring stage production. James was its lead performer. The production had been touring, and the stop at the Sunderland Empire Theatre on April 26 was the opening night of that run at this venue. The Sunderland Empire was a substantial theatre with a long history in the northeast of England. The crowd that came on April 26th had come to see Sid James, a performer they recognized and had come to expect a specific kind of entertainment from. Fellow cast member Olga Lowe, an old friend from James's early days in South African theatre, was on stage with him during the performance that evening. The two were working through a scene seated together on a sofa, perhaps 15 to 20 minutes into the play. Lowe delivered her line. James answered as scripted. She delivered her next line. He did not respond. His head had slumped and his eyes had rolled back. Lowe initially thought it was a gag. Sid James was a known prankster on stage. An unresponsive moment from him, played for absurdity, would have been entirely in character. She tried to ad-lib. The audience laughed. What they were watching looked like comic material to them as well. After a few moments of trying to get a response, Lowe realized the situation was not what it appeared. She called to the wings for the curtain to be brought down. Technical manager Melvin James, no relation to Sid, called for a doctor. The audience, still unaware, laughed when the request came through. Assuming this was also part of the play, the request had to be repeated in earnest. James was removed from the stage. Emergency assistance was sought. He was transported to Sunderland Royal Hospital. At Sunderland Royal Hospital, efforts to treat James were unsuccessful. He was pronounced dead approximately an hour after his collapse. Sid James died at Sunderland Royal Hospital on April 26, 1976. He was 62 years old. Cause of death, heart attack. Stunt wire snap. On October 12, 1984, actor and performer Jon-Erik Hexum was on the set of the CBS television series Cover Up at 20th Century Fox Studios in Los Angeles, California. He was 26 years old. The production was preparing to film an additional scene at the end of a long shooting day for the 7th episode of the season, titled Golden Opportunity. Cover Up was an action-adventure series in its first season on CBS. Hexum was one of its leads, playing Mac Harper, a former Green Beret posing as a male model while serving as an undercover CIA operative. He was young, physically striking, and had been identified as someone with significant potential as a television presence. The series was in production, working through its early episodes, establishing the rhythms of a long television shoot. A .44 Magnum revolver was on set, loaded with blank cartridges for use in filming. Prop firearms loaded with blanks are a standard element of action television production. They are used routinely, handled by cast and crew throughout a shoot, and are present on set in significant numbers across productions of this kind. Hexum had been practicing loading the weapon between takes. The crew had been shooting for hours, and the announcement of yet another scene to film prompted Hexum to make a joke to lighten the mood. Reportedly saying something to the effect of, "Can you believe this crap?" He removed all but one of the blank cartridges from the cylinder, spun it in imitation of Russian roulette, raised the revolver to his right temple, and pulled the trigger. What Hexum appears not to have understood, and what is not widely understood about blank cartridges, is that a blank discharged at point-blank range against the human skull generates concussive force sufficient to cause severe injury. A blank cartridge does not fire a bullet. It does discharge a rapidly expanding column of gas and, in many cases, wadding material with significant force. Pressed directly against the temple, that force was transmitted through the bone. The discharge fractured his skull and drove a bone fragment, roughly the size of a quarter, into his brain. Hexum collapsed on set. Cast and crew were present when it happened. Emergency services were called immediately. Hexum was transported to Beverly Hills Medical Center, then transferred to a larger facility where he underwent approximately 5 hours of surgery. The injury he had sustained was severe, and the damage to his brain was extensive. 6 days later, Hexum was declared brain dead. He was kept on life support while his family arranged for the donation of his organs. Jon-Erik Hexum was taken off life support on October 18, 1984. He was 26 years old. Cause of death, blunt force trauma to the brain, caused by the concussive discharge of the blank cartridge against his skull. His heart, kidneys, corneas, and skin were donated to multiple recipients. Live broadcast fall. On July 8, 1965, stunt pilot Paul Mantz was at the controls of a custom-built aircraft during the filming of the 20th Century Fox feature film, The Flight of the Phoenix, at Pilot Knob Mesa, near Buttercup Valley, on the California-Arizona border. He was 61 years old. The film crew and production personnel were positioned across the valley floor to capture the footage. Paul Mantz had been one of Hollywood's most respected and experienced aerial stunt pilots for decades. He had performed in and coordinated aerial sequences for major Hollywood productions, going back to the 1930s. His work included flying for Amelia Earhart on the planning of her round-the-world attempt and aerial coordination on dozens of major productions. By 1965, he had over 25,000 flight hours and a reputation that was unmatched in his field. The Flight of the Phoenix was a film about a group of survivors who built a makeshift aircraft from the wreckage of a crashed plane. For the production, Tall Mantz Aviation had hired aeronautical engineer Otto Timm to design and build a real flying aircraft to portray this improvised machine on screen. The plane, designated the Tall Mantz Phoenix P-1, had been constructed using parts taken from the other aircraft, primarily a Fairchild C-82 packet, and was an FAA-certified one-off design. Mantz's longtime business partner Frank Tallman had originally been scheduled to fly it, but Tallman had injured his leg in a go-kart accident with his son and could not perform. Mantz took over. On July 7th, Tallman had flown the Phoenix for the first aerial shots before the injury. On July 8th, Mantz was performing a touch-and-go maneuver to simulate a takeoff, with stuntman Bobby Rose strapped in behind him, representing a character played by Hardy Kruger. The first take of the day went successfully. The director called for a second take as a protection shot, to have additional usable footage in case anything was wrong with the first. During that second take, the aircraft broke apart. As Mantz brought the Phoenix down for the low pass, his rate of descent at approximately 90 miles per hour exceeded the structural limits of the aircraft. The landing gear struck the ground, the boom section behind the wings fractured, and the plane nosed over and cartwheeled. The disintegration was witnessed by everyone on location and captured on the rolling cameras. Mantz was killed instantly. Bobby Rose, thrown clear of the cockpit, survived with a broken pelvis and a broken shoulder. Emergency services were called to the remote desert location. Mantz was confirmed dead at the scene. Rose was transported for medical treatment. The accident investigation that followed identified multiple contributing factors, including Mantz's misjudgment of the pullout speed, the nose-heavy configuration of the P-1, the inadequate trim and absence of flaps, and disputed questions about toxicology testing performed on Mantz's remains hours after the crash without refrigeration. The Flight of the Phoenix was completed using a modified North American O-47A as a stand-in and was released later in 1965. The closing credits carry a tribute. It should be remembered that Paul Mantz, a fine man and a brilliant flyer, gave his life in the making of this film. Paul Mantz was pronounced dead at the scene on July 8, 1965. He was 61 years old. Cause of death, injury sustained when the aircraft broke apart during the filming sequence. Canon Act gone. On March 22, 1978, Karl Wallenda was walking a high wire strung between the two towers of the Condado Plaza Hotel in San Juan, Puerto Rico. He was 73 years old. A crowd had gathered below and in the surrounding area to watch. Karl Wallenda was the founder and patriarch of the Flying Wallendas, a family acrobatic troupe that had been performing high wire acts for decades. The Flying Wallendas had built an international reputation through generations of performance. Wallenda himself had been walking wires at extreme heights for most of his life. He had performed in circuses, arenas, and outdoor venues around the world. He had survived accidents and losses that would have ended most careers, including the 1962 pyramid collapse in Detroit that killed 2 members of his troupe and paralyzed his adopted son, and had continued performing into his 70s. The walk between the towers of the Condado Plaza Hotel in San Juan was a publicity event for a circus performance Wallenda was promoting with his granddaughter. The wire had been strung between the 2 hotel towers, approximately 10 stories above the ground, and roughly 37 meters in the air, with the wire spanning the street between the buildings. For Karl Wallenda, who had spent a lifetime at heights that most people would not approach, the setup was within the range of what he had done before. San Juan in March is warm, and the coastal location of the Condado Plaza means exposure to wind coming off the water. The conditions on the wire that day included gusting winds of up to 30 knots. Investigators later determined that the guy wires intended to stabilize the main wire had been improperly secured. The crowd that gathered to watch was below him and in surrounding areas with sightlines to the wire and the space above the street. A film crew from local station WAPA TV was capturing the walk. Wallenda began the walk. He moved out onto the wire between the 2 towers, high above the street, in front of the crowd that had assembled to watch him. About halfway across, the wind caught him. He fought to recover his balance for approximately 30 seconds, kneeling on the wire, attempting to lower his center of gravity onto it. He fell from the wire. The crowd below watched him fall. The fall from 10 stories above the ground covered a distance that left no uncertainty about what the outcome would be. He struck a parked taxi on the street below. The crowd that had come to see Karl Wallenda walk a wire witnessed his fall. The WAPA TV cameras recorded it. Emergency responders were called. The injuries sustained in a fall of that height were unsurvivable. Wallenda was pronounced dead on arrival at the hospital. Karl Wallenda was 73 years old. Cause of death: injuries sustained in the fall from the high wire above the Condado Plaza Hotel on March 22, 1978, with high winds and an improperly secured wire identified as contributing factors. Helicopter blades down. On July 23, 1982, actor Vic Morrow was on the set of Twilight Zone, the movie at Indian Dunes, a movie ranch in Valencia, California. He was 53 years old. Camera operators, crew members, and production personnel from the John Landis segment of the film were present on the location. Also present on set were 2 child actors, Micah Dinley, age 7, and Renee Shin-Yi Chen, age 6. Vic Morrow had been working in film and television since the 1950s. He was a character actor with a long career, known for his work in the television series Combat, among other productions. By 1982, he had decades of professional work behind him and was experienced in the demands of film production. Twilight Zone. The movie was an anthology film, with different segments directed by different filmmakers. The segment being filmed that night was directed by John Landis. It was set during the Vietnam War era and required large-scale pyrotechnic effects and a low-flying Bell UH-1 Iroquois helicopter working in coordination with those explosions on the ground. The location at Indian Dunes had been selected for this kind of work. The scene called for Morrow to carry both child actors through a simulated war zone while pyrotechnic explosions detonated around them and the helicopter flew overhead. It was approximately 2:20 in the morning when the sequence was filmed. Under regulations governing the employment of child actors in California, this kind of work at that hour was strictly prohibited. The required permits had not been obtained, and the children were being paid in cash off the books to circumvent state law. A fire safety officer who would normally also have served as the children's welfare worker had been kept unaware of their presence on set. The sequence began. The helicopter, piloted by Vietnam War veteran Dorsey Wingo, was hovering approximately 24 feet above the ground. Special effects explosions were detonated beneath and near the helicopter as it flew low over the set. The metal lid of one of the mortar effects was propelled upward by the explosion and struck the helicopter's tail rotor, causing it to fail and detach. The helicopter spun out of control. It came down into the area where Morrow and the 2 children were positioned. The right landing skid struck Renee Shin-Yi Chen first. The main rotor blades then struck Vic Morrow and Micah Dinley. All 3 were killed. The 6 occupants of the helicopter survived, with injuries. Emergency responders were called to the Indian Dunes location. All 3 victims on the ground were confirmed dead at the scene. The production was shut down immediately. The accident triggered investigations by multiple agencies, including the National Transportation Safety Board, which examined the helicopter's loss of control and the proximity of the pyrotechnic effects to the aircraft. Criminal charges of involuntary manslaughter were filed against director John Landis and 4 other individuals associated with the production: associate producer George Folsey Jr., unit production manager Dan Allingham, special effects coordinator Paul Stewart, and helicopter pilot Dorsey Wingo. The trial that followed was lengthy. In 1987, after extensive legal proceedings, Landis and all 4 co-defendants were acquitted of all charges, with the prosecution unable to prove that the accident had been foreseeable. The incident led to significant changes in safety regulations governing film productions in California, including revised child labor laws controlling when and under what conditions child actors could be employed on sets involving hazardous work, and stricter rules governing the use of helicopters in film production. Vic Morrow was pronounced dead at the scene at Indian Dunes on July 23, 1982. He was 53 years old. Micah Dinlay, age 7, and Renee Shinyi Chen, age 6, were also pronounced dead at the scene. Cause of death for all 3: injuries sustained when the helicopter rotor and landing skid struck them during the filming sequence. If you want to see more, click the video on screen now.